Webinar for you today around data loss prevention, especially in a remote work world. We're going to have two great speakers with us. We're going to have Phil Rowland and Mike Owens, who I'm glad to say are part of my team. So I'm super excited that these guys are here. I'm also looking forward to the conversation today because this topic comes up quite a bit. Let's go through some quick housekeeping items on the next slide here. Great. So yes, this webinar is being recorded. Saw that come through on the questions already, which is awesome. We are being recorded. The full replay will be available on our YouTube page. So that's a great place to look for all sorts of content, including previous webinars. If there's any questions and answers, use the Q&A function in Zoom and we'll be able to get a hold of you. I see someone there asked for some pre-show banter. Well, we'll maybe do that next time. So appreciate the input and we'll go from there. If you registered, you will receive an email when the recording is available, and feel free to ask some questions as we go along. A little bit about Trusted Sec if you're new to our organization. We are best-in-class consultants meeting a full-service security offering. So we do a lot of things for you, but it's all focused around helping you to improve the security of your organization. Starting off, we have some security testing and analysis where we do red team, blue team, purple teams. We do mobile testing, hardware testing, all sorts of things around testing your environment. We have a full compliance program where we're going to work on business risk assessments, PCI assessments, you name it. A great team over there. Security program management. If you need help building out your security program, we have the team for you. If you ever get stuck and you're like, hey, we need to improve how we operate, we need to fix some of these problems, and we just don't have the depth that we need, we can help you with that. We can also provide training for you and education and helping you to get better at what you do every day. And finally, we have our IR and forensics team that is sadly right now very busy and growing. So we know there's quite a bit of incidents out there taking place, and that is a very busy team. Go to the next slide. Awesome. So our process is a process-oriented, holistic approach to improving. We start building your program, testing your program, fixing it, and as we said, remediating. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and get started. Today's topic. We're going to jump through the next one real quick. Yep, there we go. So today's roadmap, I'm going to hand it over to two amazing resources. I'm going to give you a quick little background. So we have Mike Owens, who joins us from a background in compliance and making sure things are set up the right way, especially in healthcare and other areas. And Phil Rowland, who has a deep background in all sorts of spaces, actually, but a very deep technical background, and is also excellent in both these guys are great in Office 365 and the DLP environment as part of Office 365, which is a little bit what we're going to talk about. So without me bantering on anymore, I'm going to hand it over to Mike and Phil. There you go, guys. Have a great time.
Thanks, Paul, for the intro there. Hi, I'm Phil, just so you have an idea of whose voice is whose. And today we're going to be going through DLP, essentially. What is DLP? How does it help us with remote work challenges? What does it do and what does it not do? That's also a big point that we want to touch on today. We also want to talk about how to actually go through some of those more technical implementations, what to think about, what tools within the DLP stack you can put to work for certain things you need to achieve. And then also some action items to take away from this and get to work securing the data in your environment. Mike, do you want to take the takeaways page?
Sure. So all of this we want to wrap up into two big ideas that you can take away from this conversation, this presentation today. One is to really have a solid understanding of which challenges DLP helps you solve. We're going to focus a lot on the remote work world, since that has been our reality for this past year. But a lot of this is really going to be applicable, even outside of just that remote work context. So looking at the different ways to apply DLP, where it fits, where it doesn't fit, what it does for you, what it doesn't do for you. And then going beyond that understanding, diving into what are some specific next steps that you can take, starting this afternoon, starting tomorrow, to get the DLP capabilities within Microsoft 365 set up and starting to work effectively for your organization.
Awesome, thanks. So high level, what is DLP, right? That's kind of the first place that we need to start, is to lay some of that groundwork here. And primarily what DLP is the tool that lets us find and protect sensitive data, right? If that's kind of the high level goal of what DLP is. Sensitive data can mean a bunch of different things. It could be financial data, personal data, health data. Those are kind of the big three in the compliance spaces that people are concerned about. But it also can mean organizational secrets, right? So this is trade secrets, internal documents, conversations between the chiefs, that sort of thing. You want to be able to protect that. DLP also applies to very specific locations. So primarily, this used to be email was the big concern. In today's world, this is really now more about SharePoint, OneDrive, and to a certain extent Teams. But DLP really should cover all of the different locations, just maybe protect it in a little bit different way depending on where it is. And the way that DLP does this is it uses conditions, and it gives you the ability to apply some logic within those conditions so that you can make a protective action, take a protective action against an action that a user is trying to do, right? So they could be trying to send an email, they could be trying to share a document, and based on those conditions that you configure, we need to protect that document in a different way. To kind of narrow the scope about today, we're actually going to be specifically talking about the Microsoft 365 implementation of DLP. But from a high level, this sort of conversation that we're going through could apply to other solutions. We're just really kind of focused on this tool stack for today.
So as we look at the remote work environment over the last year or so, probably most of us have learned a lot more about remote work than any of us really imagined, given this pandemic. It raised a lot of challenges from an IT and security standpoint, changed a lot of the ways that many organizations were thinking about security, and raised a whole bunch of questions. Some of the questions that we want to hone in on today, where DLP is a relevant factor, are these here. So it's these considerations around what I'm calling unforced errors, herding cats, and the palace guards. So unforced errors being the stuff where we are just making the mistake ourselves. There's not some adversary that's busting in and stealing something. This is the trip over your own shoelaces and expose file servers to the internet. We've all heard the stories of like Amazon S3 buckets and things like that, just with no security around them. Nobody intended to do that. Nobody did that maliciously. But that stuff keeps happening. And so those are the kinds of things where DLP is really going to help, is understanding and protecting from those kinds of making mistakes ourselves scenarios. Herding cats then is this question of where is our data? Where is the sensitive stuff that we need to protect? And then how do we keep it in just the areas that we want it? How do we make sure it stays under control and in the places that we need it to be? Let's face it, for most organizations, sensitive data is everywhere. It might be that production database that a developer copied to their local machine for testing purposes, files and emails that end up on personal devices, that giant, too big to fail file server organization system that I know you've got, and organization is in air quotes there, where there's all sorts of moving pieces and highly sensitive files are getting mixed in with not so sensitive stuff, which folders are okay to share, which files are okay to share, all of those things. DLP is a lot about getting a handle on that, getting an understanding around that. Because if you don't know what you have and you don't know where it is and you can't manage where it is, then there's no way you're going to protect it from yourselves, never mind from some kind of adversary. This is certainly another area where applying DLP well is going to really help you shine. But it's also an area where it's very easy to get analysis paralysis, where you try and do everything at once or try and fix 10 years worth of history all at, in one shot. And so, we'll talk a little bit about some approaches to just focus on moving forward in terms of applying some of these controls and conditions and labeling. And then once systems are in place, then starting to work backward. It's certainly very easy to try and bite off way too much and just get stuck. And then the Palace Guards area, and Phil's really going to unpack this in a second for us. If we've had anything out of this pandemic and work from home that we've all been pushed into, I hope we can all agree that the idea of the perimeter as the security boundary, or the castle and moat sort of theory of security, that is dead, that really was dead beforehand, but that the pandemic we can just take that out of our lexicon, because there is no such thing as that physical perimeter anymore. And so it raises this question of, without that concept, how do we keep the crown jewels? How do we keep this stuff safe? And DLP plays a role in this. But what we want to caution against, and what Phil's going to unpack a lot more in a second here, is DLP is not the answer for this. A lot of people think that DLP is the answer for this, and DLP plays a role, but DLP is not how you keep the adversaries away from your most sensitive data. I know we've got red teamers and pen testers here at Trusted Sec, and they will tell you, to a man, to a woman, that DLP is not what's going to stop them. DLP is very much about helping prevent us from making mistakes, not stopping a bad guy from doing something nefarious. So Phil, why don't you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So yeah, as Mike mentioned, DLP has very specific use cases, and we want to make sure that we're clear about what DLP can do and in certain cases cannot do. A great way to demonstrate that is actually this little graphic that came from Microsoft. They just had a new release of some new features that they've rolled into DLP general availability. And they had this little graphic towards the end, and I saw that and I'm like, that is a perfect image of exactly the kinds of misconceptions that we see a lot, is that DLP helps me with all of these various things. It can help protect from, malicious software stealing my data, or it can help from, some insider, whether this be an employee or whether this be, somebody who forced their way inside, getting access to data and then removing it from the environment. And that really does not cover what DLP is meant to do, right? So DLP is meant to prevent accidental sharing of information. It's meant to prevent data seepage, and then you can use it for classification and discoveries, right? So what do we mean by accidental sharing? This is, again, that, sending it to the wrong recipient, including sensitive content in something that you didn't realize was public, right? So there's a document that's already shared with somebody externally, and you add some sensitive content to it, not realizing who the audiences are. Having an overly inclusive group or SharePoint site or something like that. So again, not fully understanding who the full audience of this location is, and then throwing a document in there. And it also covers sort of trusted outsiders who have legitimate access to data within your environment, but you need to make sure that their use of your data is only what you want it to be. Data seepage is it's kind of like a pseudo data leak, right? So it's not quite out of your environment yet. It's not quite out of your hands, but it's often these devices that maybe you don't have as much protection around the data as you would in on a fully managed Windows device or something like that, right? So think mobile devices, Think, unmanaged third party, someone's OneDrive, personal OneDrive that they're putting documents onto. We want to be able to prevent that, and DLP definitely can make some headway towards that. Classification is really more on the Azure information protection side of things with sensitivity labels, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But being able to classify a document and understand what sensitivity label, what kinds of protections do we need to put on this document? DLP gives you the ability to scan through the content of that and classify a document, so to speak. And then discovery, this is finding all the data, right? Finding all of those locations that you have the data. It can find it in, on the endpoints, it can find it in the cloud. It can, in some cases, find it in third-party cloud. So just being able to find all of that, as Mike mentioned in the previous slide, DLP can help us with that challenge. What it can't help us with is sort of this insider threat and data theft protection. It's not really going to prevent somebody who's focused on getting data out of your environment from manipulating it in some way that then they can take it out of the environment, right? So DLP doesn't apply to an SSH tunnel. So that, that's one case of, a very simple solution being able to bypass DLP. What it can do is it can limit the scope of where that data already resides and can be accessed from, so that you can try to limit what you have to protect, right? So if we don't let sensitive data leave onto unmanaged devices, then we only have to make sure we protect our managed devices, which can really sort of reduce that threat landscape for those sorts of attacks. And we have, oh, that's the wrong link, never mind. I'll mention the other link later. So our favorite topic, licensing, right? So one of the big challenges that we see for organizations to properly implement DLP is that the licensing is really hard to understand. What do I need to apply this particular feature? We've got a couple references that we can link here, but primarily there's a couple things to think about. One is the difference between E3 and E5 licenses, and this applies for most of the different features and products. But moving from E3 to E5 is really about adding automation. For DLP, it's about adding teams, so real-time communication, scanning. In most of these, it also adds Cloud App Security, or at least some feature within Cloud App Security, which is a CASB product. Super helpful for sort of third-party services, being able to make sure that your data prevention can affect those services. It oftentimes adds Azure Information Protection, the scanner. So there's a scanner for on-premise. Not a huge focus for this conversation since it's work from home, but it is something that's available if you need to be able to move your on-premise stuff into the cloud DLP products. And then, also with E5 comes pretty much everything else, right? So if you're looking at the Microsoft E5 licensing specifically, it basically includes the entire platform. The other differentiation that's important to make is the difference between Office and Microsoft. So like there's an Office E3 and there's a Microsoft E3. And essentially by going to the Microsoft version of that license, you're adding in all the third-party cloud solutions, a lot of the on-premise products for DLP, and pretty much all of the endpoint protection stuff as well, right? You can layer on, any of these protections that you want, right? So if you only care about having Cloud App Security, you can go and buy a specific Cloud App Security license. If you're only concerned with certain compliance features, right? So if we only care about the information governance piece of the compliance license, you can just go buy that one bundle for your users. But it's really important to think about this early on and make sure that you've got the right licensing for the right users before you expect that benefit to kick in. And Mike and I bashed our heads together and came up with a quote here that it kind of drives it home, I think, which is, if you can't afford to lose sensitive data, then you can't afford to get the licensing wrong. It's really that important. So data classification, this is really about, again, understanding what kinds of information exists in the files that we're managing, right? So there's a couple different ways that we can classify things in the higher DLP schema of Microsoft 365. The first one is sensitivity labels, which is part of, it's really closely tied to Azure information protection, but this is your traditional classification, right? So you can create your own models, this internal, public, confidential, highly confidential, whatever terminology you want to use. And you can let your employees, your users, actually assign those labels themselves. At the E5, again, with the automation, you can do some automatic labeling based on various things. So you can use content types, you can use locations, you can say this group of users always has this label applied. And then you can restrict other sorts of things, the ability to remove the labeling or the ability to see documents that have a particular label. So that's your traditional classification. Sensitive information types is the DLP, that is the traditional DLP model, which is driver's license, credit card, social security numbers, that sort of stuff. You can add custom types, so you can specify new types of data. So if you have, let's say, a customer ID that for you really want to be able to manage what happens with this customer ID, you can go ahead and add a custom sensitive information type that's scoped to that item, and then that lets you, apply DLP policies to that as well. You can also use any of these classification types to remove things from a scope of a policy as well, which is a pretty handy thing that we can talk about a little bit later. Unified labeling. So this is the idea that all of these labels that you can configure within the Security Center in Office 365 flow out to all of the other places. So that's Office 365, Windows information protection on actual endpoints, Azure information protections, kind of the sensitivity label stuff, mobile devices, and in some cases using Cloud App Security even to third party, right? So once you've got your document labeled, that can then apply to third party stuff. That's why the Microsoft 365 platform seems to be so powerful with very little configuration requirements. Retention and disposition. So these labels are also part of kind of the Azure information protection. These labels are really about making sure that the data is either available for legal reasons, right? So we can't delete it until 7 years goes by, or in case of disposition, like stuff that we just need to get rid of, right? So a perfect example of disposition is, we know we need customer driver's license numbers because of XYZ process, but we only need it for that initial first couple days while we onboard the customer. Once everything's done with that, we should not have any of that information in email or documents or any of that. So disposition policies can find those, mark a disposition label on it, and then based on the policy say, okay, after 2 weeks, get rid of it. Super handy. The other really powerful classification type that we can use in DLP is exact data match. So exact data match lets us take a known set of information, right? So think that, that maybe that customer ID, again, we've got a list of customer IDs. We can go ahead and take that list and perform some hash functions. So Microsoft has a tool that does this on-prem, so you're not shipping your sensitive data all to the cloud. But it hashes the sensitive information and then uploads that hashed database, and it uses that to scan through all of your content and find anything that exactly matches that content, whether it's an ID or text or whatever it is. And then using that, you can either apply different policy actions to it, or you can actually remove things, right? So it's a great tool for excluding known false positives. We do want to be careful about that. Anytime you're excluding things for false positive tuning, you want to make sure that you're also taking into account that number might just also so happen to match something that is important, right? So if you're getting rid of let's say account numbers, but because they happen to look like driver's license numbers, In some cases, that actually might be a legitimate driver's license number. So you want to think about that when you're tuning things. But exact data match is a really good tool to be able to kind of hone in on that fine tuning. Integrations. So I've alluded to a few of these already, but there are other tools in the stack, right? So there are other tools in the security stack, especially within the Microsoft world, that play really well with DLP and can either help enforce DLP actions or in some case inform things, right? So Cloud App Security is great. It's that traditional CASB tool. With file policies, you can enforce DLP protections for people who aren't on devices that you manage, right? So maybe it's that trusted third party. Again, you can use Cloud App Security to make sure that they're only accessing non-sensitive files or whatever, or files that they're allowed to access. You can also control third-party cloud products. So the documents that are getting uploaded to Salesforce, if that has sensitive information in it, you can also use Cloud App Security to enforce protection actions on those. The Sentinel. So Sentinel is the SIM tool from Microsoft. What's really nice about Sentinel or any SIM really is if you're centralizing your DLP alerts into there, it's that single pane of glass. It's the one place that you need to go to find all of the things that you need to address. And also some of those alerts can then be used to detect anomalous user activity, right? If Joe from accounting never looks at the sensitive information that's over on in the executive forms, and then all of a sudden you get some user alerts about him trying to share that's unique. And maybe it's not just a DLP alert, but maybe it's also, Joe's account has been compromised. So having that in a SIM can then help you kind of pull all that together. Azure Information Protection. Again, this is a piece that can sometimes be confused, and a lot of people think that this is just part of the DLP licensing, but really it's a slightly separate thing. But in a lot of cases, you get much of this feature with the bundles that you have. But the real point of Azure Information Protection is to apply protection actions to a document. So whether that's applying a sensitivity label to the document that restricts copying of files or copying of the content out of the document, right? So let's make sure that all of that content stays within sort of the security boundary of the document itself. Watermarking the document. I don't typically use watermarks a lot, but I know a lot of people do for various reasons. So that's where that feature exists. Encrypting the file. For me, encrypting the file with AIP is a huge bonus. The key escrow factor of the file encryption means that you can revoke an external party's access to a document at any time. And by doing that, they would no longer have access to that content. Pair that with the ability to restrict copying of the files out, and now you can be reasonably assured that most users, most people that you're dealing with would not have been able to figure out a way to get the content out of that file. So again, something that can leave your environment, and if you can apply a protection action to it before it leaves, then you can make sure that you have control over that information. And then finally, the AIP scanner, which I mentioned earlier, is part of Azure Information Protection. This is the ability to deploy a sensor on-prem and find all of that content in either network shares or SharePoint on-premise. So it kind of ties all the things together, and you can use Cloud DLP to manage those rules.
And I'll just quickly jump in and mention that Cloud App Security, Sentinel, and AIP bring a lot of other capabilities and benefits when you're looking at the challenges of remote workforce. So the fact that they integrate with DLP plus bring everything else to the table is part of why this is a solid ecosystem and why we're focusing in on that.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. So the real meat of what we're talking about here is in this slide, right? When we go to do DLP, right? So we've done our classification. We've got everyone with the right licensing. We've integrated all the things so we can get alerts and we can control the right things. Now we have to actually sit down and figure out what do we do. So this is for me, the primary list of things that I consider when we roll into an environment and need to kind of look at DLP. And the reason why that is we don't really want to over-tune anything. We don't want to try to use DLP as a way to control every single document with a different policy. What we're looking to do is cast some really wide nets and find everything and make sure that we're covering those use cases, right? So make sure that we're not allowing accidental sharing, make sure that we're not allowing the data to leave and go to devices that we don't manage. And then, sort of making sure that we understand where all the data is using incident management, right? So the first side of that is the conditions, right? So we have to build the net. We have to come up with a set of rules that we can throw out there and find all of the information that we care about. And so we can do that in a number of ways in the DLP world. We can use the actual sensitive info types, right? That traditional sensitive information, driver's license number, credit card number, that kind of thing. And pair that with a series of the count and the confidence, right? So the confidence level is how sure is the system that this is actually a social security number? And then how many numbers did it find within a single document? It's important to think about those conditions because we often will have this scenario of, an HR or an HR department that has to manage drug tests. For legal reasons, you have to have random drug tests with the employees. And so they have to communicate with an external third party. And that just so happens to have social security numbers or driver's license numbers in that document. We have to set aside a policy rule that allows for HR to send a document to this one particular company with one social security number. But we don't really want HR sending 5 social security numbers out in one document. There is no use case for that. Right. So understanding what it is that's normal in your environment and then throwing a wide net that says everything else that falls outside of that, let's go ahead and do something with that. Microsoft information protection labels. So the Microsoft information protection label is sort of what Microsoft calls that unified labeling of AIP stuff. So, on endpoints in the cloud, everywhere you can use a label, and then using DLP, you can use that label as a condition for a policy, right? So that's another great way to take any manual classification that you're doing, to mark something sensitive or confidential, and then say, okay, that shouldn't be allowed to go outside the environment, right? So emails between chiefs should never leave unless they specifically say, yep, this one's okay to go. Identity of sender, recipient, organization. So you can classify this as well. So again, that sort of emails between chiefs. You can apply a policy. You can apply different policy actions based on who they are, who they're sending information to, who they're sharing it with, or even at the organizational level. So again, going back to the HR department drug test example, we could then say, okay, if they're sending it to this one drug testing company, at suchandsuch.com. That's fine. If they're sending it anywhere else, that's not fine. So another great way to really narrow down what the use case is. Document metadata. I don't see this in as much use, but sometimes like with PDFs and things like that, there will be metadata flagged inside of the document that you can use as a determining factor for what protection actions to take. So I like to call it out just because some people have valid use cases for that. And kind of the final condition is the actual location of the data, right? So I call out the 365 services because these are the primary ways that we think about it, right? So is it in a particular SharePoint site? You can treat different SharePoint sites differently. You can treat different OneDrive locations differently. You can apply policies that only apply to Exchange, that sort of thing. So once you've built your condition, once you've built that net using a combination of these conditions, and you've gathered up, you've drawn that circle around the data that you need to protect, then you can apply a particular action to it. And it's important to note that within a single policy, you can have multiple rules assigned, right? So each rule is a set of conditions. So you could have rules that stack up in severity, right? So you could say, generally speaking, anyone sharing Social Security numbers of more than 5 numbers in a document just blocks automatically. If it's only one document from HR or not from HR, encrypt it. And if it's one from HR going to that one particular company, then just let it out. So you can have those sorts of levels to the policy. But the types of actions that we can take, this is a really important thing to focus on, because the use case for DLP is essentially to stop people from doing things accidentally, right? Or to stop things from going out unprotected. And so which action we choose is probably the most important thing for the success of kind of our DLP implementation. If we're too heavy-handed with an action, with a protective action, users are going to complain. It's going to go to the executives. The whole project is going to get rolled back. Or you might just find that people start using a different service, right? So all of a sudden you realize that, okay, we were too heavy-handed with our Salesforce MCAS implementation, and the salespeople decided that they were just going to go spin up some other service to use. So avoiding those things is critical to getting a good DLP implementation. And so the first thing is, notifications. So the least heavy-handed thing you can do is just notifying someone that a potentially bad thing happened. Security alerts and incidents are different in the DLP world. The incident is really kind of the details around sort of that rule match. So it'll have content details in it. We don't generally like to look at those for alerting. Just like send all of those somewhere to be filed off, like send those to the SIM and then ingest them later. Alerts are the ones where you're defining the list of things that you need to jump on right now. And I would definitely recommend only having alerts for things that you for sure need to jump on right away. Blocking sharing is the traditional action that we talk about with DLP. So somebody shares a document or somebody sends an email to an external person with sensitive information in it, and Exchange blocks the email and it sends the user a notification, or it actually turns off the sharing of that file as a recourse to having done something against policy. So that's kind of the traditional one. Notifying users is super important. So we'll get into this in the last point, but one of the biggest benefits to DLP is that you can actually train your users and teach your users that these documents have this type of sensitive information and you shouldn't be doing this with it, right? You shouldn't be sharing that with external people or whatever the case may be. And a lot of times accidental sharing can be just that. They didn't know that was considered sensitive, or they didn't know that that SharePoint site was open to external people. And so by having a notification that sends to them, either in an email notification or in policy tips, right? If you have the EMS licensing, you can do policy tips. So a little note shows up right at the top of Word that says, hey, you just typed in a Social Security number into this document and it's shared with external people. You can't do that. Those sorts of feedback are probably the best use case for DLP to help teach people, first of all, what types of information they need to be careful with, and also what locations are safe and which ones aren't. And then encrypting the data, again, this is probably my favorite protection action that you can take because of the ability to roll things back. It's also the most useful in that there are going to be times in your deployment of DLP where, for whatever reason, the organization has decided, like, we have to be able to send this data. We have to be able to send this to external people, and they have to be able to see it. And that's just what we do. And so encrypting the data gives you some level of control, even though it's left your environment. So the key to that is making sure that it happens before it leaves the environment. But with DLP, having scanning, having it automatically do the sensitive information type scanning lets you set that encryption, and it's not super intrusive, right? So it still lets the content be shared, but it applies a protective action. And then overrides are the ability for users to be able to say, I know that this is sensitive information and I know that I'm not supposed to do this, but I just have to. For whatever reason is, the user in that moment can make the decision to say, yes, I'm going to override this policy and send it anyways. It's trying to not be heavy-handed. Let's let the users do what they think they need to be able to do. But let's track it. So let's definitely review all of that, and let's use those overrides as a way of more finely tuning any exceptions that we need to put in place.
Because as Phil alluded to earlier, you don't want to make your users get stuck somewhere. This should not become a blockage to the fundamental operation of the business. When that starts to happen, people inherently will work around the controls you've got in place to figure out how to get their jobs done. And I think the other thing to remember here is that most people really mean well most of the time. It's easy, for those of us that focus on security, to only think about the outside bad actors, only think about the insider threats, only think about people trying to be malicious. But for the most part, all of our users are trying to do the right thing, or at least they're not trying to do the wrong thing. And so, if we look back at those three major concerns that we talked about earlier, the unforced errors, the herding cats, and the palace guards, the majority of the triggers for these DLP conditions, the majority of things that are going to trigger alerts or trigger incidents, it's going to be related to those unforced errors, to trying to prevent or interrupt those. That's where the majority of these action events are going to happen. It's much more likely that an employee is going to unintentionally attempt to email a document that they should not email, rather than it's versus the likelihood that a Chinese spy is rooting around your network and trying to steal something. Just the volumes are different there. And so using these actions, whether it's the policy tips, the overrides, the notifications, even the blocks, to interrupt those mistake situations, interrupt the well-intentioned action where they're trying to get something done, but they're just not going about it the right way. It can prevent a mistake from happening that has a large impact. And it can also lead to those conversations of, is there a better way that I should be doing this? Or, are the rules too tight? Do we need to create a legitimate exception here? But it creates that dialogue.
Yeah, exactly. And to give to go back to a previous example, the HR company, the HR department might not realize that, employees' social security numbers are something that they need to worry about from a legal standpoint. And maybe it's not, I'm not a lawyer, but you can see the example of where somebody who's actually dealing with a particular piece of data just didn't realize that was something they needed to be concerned about. And so having a policy that casts a net around that in some way and notifies them, at least draws it to somebody's attention to ask the question and make sure that those steps, are being taken to protect it. The other actions that can come into place that are a little bit outside of the traditional DLP side of things, are things like mobile application management policies and cloud app security. And so we can use the existing classifications that we've done all that work up till now, but maybe we're not using the actual DLP policy. Maybe we are, using conditional access to throw all OneDrive and SharePoint connections through Cloud App Security, and we're scanning for sensitive information there and making sure that it only leaves to managed devices, right? That's one use case that you could use for, part of the DLP system, which is the classification side of things, but using a different tool to actually do the enforcement. And those are totally, reasonable and feasible things to do in the Microsoft platform, and we've seen that be really successful. So if that's something that you're considering, it's definitely doable. That is totally something that you can pursue. So our final little slide here with a bunch of information is sort of that action items list. This is kind of a prioritized order of, if we want to go through and do, let's do DLP, how do we do that? So the first thing you need to do, and we've alluded to this throughout, is define your organizational requirements. Understand what it is that you need to protect, and what the organization needs to be able to do with that data. So what are those organizational use cases of the data? To review licensing assignments. So now that you know what you need to protect, where it is, sort of, make sure that you have the right licensing for all your users. Get that process started, because if that's a budget process, that's going to take a bit of time. 3, start with classifications of your data. So if you have sensitive information types that are not already predefined, get those predefined so that the scanning engine can start churning through all your stuff and classifying stuff for you. If you're going to use sensitivity labels, get those defined and start training users on what they mean and when to use them. For limiting external account access, so this is, again, sort of that narrowing of scope to help with adversarial threats. So, don't let external users have access to certain types of data. Just implement that block right off the bat. Or maybe it's, we're not going to let sensitive data get onto unmanaged devices using that conditional access policy to Cloud App Security workflow. So starting to limit the scope is kind of the next step. And then for everything else, start with alert policies. Start with a policy that shows you when something that you think shouldn't be happening actually happens, and see how many alerts you get. If it blows you up, you know that you were too over-inclusive. And then you can start to look at those cases where you are getting alerts and say, okay, is this something we actually need to do? And go have that conversation with, the data stewards in your organization. Who's actually responsible for that kind of a thing? Let's go have that conversation, and let's figure out if this is the right way to do it, or if that was unexpected for them also, and we need to go turn that policy up. 6, educating and notifying your users. So before you start putting actual policies in place that make changes to stuff, get the education out there, right? Let people know that this is happening. When things happen in a normal person's workday, that all of a sudden is different today than it was yesterday, this new pop-up is showing up. We want to avoid those sorts of situations. It just causes confusion. It causes friction.
And this is doubly important in the remote work scenarios that we're facing now, because there's no way for it's much harder for the frustrations or the anything like that to bubble up when people don't have the water cooler to gossip at, don't have their manager sitting across the hall to start to filter that information back and forth. So especially with people remote, that communication around what's happening, why it's happening, and how it helps them protect themselves is extremely, extremely important.
Mm-hmm. Limiting sensitive data to trusted devices and apps. We talked about this a little bit. Mobile application management is probably one of the better ways that I've seen of actually implementing this. And that's really because it's part of the holistic Microsoft platform. Office 365 knows that it can trust the Outlook app on your phone to do what it's supposed to do if it hands the policy off. So being able to implement policies there, and then also being able to then restrict what types of information go to what types of devices can help you limit that threat vector. And then 8, encrypting files for key workflows. Again, if you have sensitive information that must leave your environment as part of a key workflow to your organization, and just encrypt the file, right? Identify what those workflows are, identify, either the senders, the recipients, the content type, and let it go out, but encrypt it on its way. It's not really something that, users have to think about when they send it, it'll happen. And then if you do need to revoke that later, you can revoke it. It is something that some people look at and they're like, oh, hey, that's fantastic. You mean I could share this document with, outside counsel for 2 weeks and then revoke their access? Perfect, let me do that, right? So in some cases, it can actually enable business workflows, but at the very least, it can definitely protect certain kinds of organizational workflows. And then number 9, once you've done all of those other things and you have a better idea of what's going on in your environment, you've encrypted the stuff and allowed the stuff that needs to happen, you've limited where the data can actually go, users are familiar with what's happening, now start putting in your blocks, right? Now start putting in all those protective actions that apply more intrusive things into people's workflow. And if you need to, in certain circumstances, let them override, right? So don't try to overtune the environment, because you'll lose the visibility, which is the whole point of DLP, is being able to see where the data is. If you tune alerts out, you don't see it. If you turn actions out, you're not protecting it. So instead, I prefer at least to overprotect, but then allow overrides. And then let's just have a sort of review process, a review cycle for anything that a user overrides, so that we can use that as a very specific use case to go back and maybe tune those out, or maybe that's just something that we audit. Maybe that's just a thing that we have to audit from now on.
Taking a step kind of above this action items level, but that's also really foundational to making all of this successful, is the getting management buy-in to this whole process, and not just up the technical reporting chain, but realizing that this is going to affect the different business units and functional teams within the organization. And so management buy-in kind of across the board of what this is and how it's valuable, how it's helping, so that putting it in place doesn't lead to a general revolt.
Hey guys, I think we do have quite a few questions in there. Some of them were covered already, but if we have a few minutes, let's see. There's a couple around licensing that kind of came up. So,
yep. So I see one here about, does E5 have MCAS or separate? So the E5 does have cloud app security, but it depends on whether it's the Office cloud app security. So if you have the Office E3, then it's just the Office version of cloud app security, which is essentially all of the Office 365 cloud suites. If you have Microsoft E5, then you get MCAS, right? So the Microsoft version of cloud app security, which is all of the extra third-party integrations and all that fun stuff.
Well, yeah. And again, Microsoft didn't help us out by making them all sound the same and look the same and everything else. So, but they're definitely different, and those licenses do have a lot of different impact. Let's take a look at some of these other ones that came in there. What else would you guys like to cover there?
Okay, so do I count credentials, API keys, tokens, environmental variables, etc. in sensitive data? The answer to that is yes. So especially API keys and tokens almost never have a legitimate reason to be at least shared publicly, probably not even shared internally. And the fact that they exist somewhere in your environment is definitely something that you want to be able to review. So there's a content explorer in DLP in the compliance portal, in the DLP section, that you can use to find specific types of information. So if you put in a custom information type for that kind of thing, API keys and tokens and environment variables, you could definitely find those, and then use Content Explorer to find where they're actually located, and then go smack some hands if you have to. I don't know how effective the protection actions would be, simply because you're probably not emailing those out. Those are probably things that are landing in GitHub or some other thing there. And I haven't actually looked at that specific workflow, but being able to identify it is kind of the key piece there.
Yeah, and there's some things that you mentioned that can actually scan the environments for different things, right? You mentioned that a little bit.
Yeah, so the Azure Information Protection Scanner can apply those same content filtering rules on premises, right? So you can scan
On-premise, right?
premise file
Yeah.
share for the same stuff.
And then remotely, if they have the OneDrive for Business enabled, that's another way to have it kind of look at.
Yeah, the EMS licensing gives you, to a certain extent, endpoint DLP. Microsoft E3 gives you endpoint DLP protections, so you can actually protect stuff in the Office applications.
Mhm.
I don't remember what licensing you need for the actual Windows version of that.
Licensing is always a challenge, and it's going to be specific to the types of organizations too, right? So nonprofits versus education versus all sorts of different mixes and matches there. So
Best bet on the licensing front is to dig out the Microsoft has a number of different kind of crosswalks for the particular features or actions, and then which licenses include that capability. And that's really, more than us even trying to quote it, because it changes with some frequency. The Microsoft docs are going to be the answer there.
Yeah, I'm gonna, if I can find how to chat in this webinar thing, I will send one. I think here it is.
So there's a question here about why companies are not implementing DLP. I think that it's specifically not implementing the Microsoft 365 version, but generally there's a lot of confusion, as we talked about, around DLP, what it is and what it does, and the degree to which it needs to be implemented. It can certainly seem like a major lift to figure out how to get every document classified and figure out every action to take with every kind of document. So thinking in the broader strokes, and then kind of start where you're at, and work through the kind of 10-point checklist that we had on the previous slide, to shape what you're trying to accomplish, and then use the DLP capabilities to meet that. But also realizing that DLP implementation and maintenance is not a one and done. It is a constantly evolving challenge based on the different workflows and the different business needs. And so, diving into that, you do need to have a little bit of a plan together for how is this going to be supported long term. It doesn't need to be a heavy lift once you get it going, but it's not something that you can just, as the old commercial goes, set it and forget it.
good point. Let's see, some other questions. I know there's a few more here, and we're running right at the up against time.
So here's a question about how well DLP works with other antivirus solutions. So pretty much all of the Microsoft DLP stuff does not rely on the local antivirus. So it's built into the Office suite itself. If you're looking at the on the device DLP stuff. And so I haven't actually seen any issues with it, with antivirus causing a problem there. You may want to look at what the actual overlay of protections are, right? So AV has one particular set of use cases, and DLP is really about the data. So you would want to look at what kinds of things from the DLP scope of things your AV is actually providing. But in most cases, they're totally separate, and they'll work just fine together.
Great. That was answered. Good. I think there's some questions around kind of customizing some of the matching and the rules. I think that's probably a little bit, we can get into that, customizing those, that they are customizable, right? So let's talk a little bit about, how do we create some of those rules? What flexibility do we have there? That's something we can touch on.
Yeah, I mean, do you have a
couple hours?
Question?
There was
because there yeah,
there was a couple questions
Probably the answer here is there's a lot of customization capability, and as Phil talked about earlier, the ability to layer conditions together and get different outcomes. based on which kind of group of conditions gets met by a certain document or a certain set of data. But beyond that, it would really be kind of very specific to the environment and the business need of any given organization.
Perfect. Very good. Thanks. Any of the other ones that you guys are able to answer in a short time, or some of these other ones?
Yeah, so there's Don has a question here about beyond the action items list, what are the key things to think about in which order based on what license you have? For me, if you have EMS, get your endpoint protection stuff, your endpoint management in. That's going to drive a whole bunch of other conversations, right? So now you can actually use devices as a leveraging factor and a condition within your DLP policy. So that's huge. Cloud app security is really nice for protecting that third-party stuff. So if you have a lot of third-party solutions where you're storing data, cloud app security becomes much higher on the to-do list, which is only really a thing in the E5 world. So if you're in the E3 world, except for education, I think, you're really, cloud app security isn't going to do anything for you because you only get the discovery piece. So ignore that. Other than that, I mean, the integration, that kind of integration side of things that we talked about, making sure that you get AIP, making sure that you get cloud app security, making sure you get Sentinel if you have access to it linked together. That's really where you get the multiplication factor of DLP.
Excellent. Very good. Well, I think we're a few minutes over. We really appreciate everyone for joining us for this conversation. And hopefully we got to a few of those answers. I know we kind of were running out of time there. So we do appreciate it. Again, just as a reminder, if you did register, you will get an email with a link to this. Otherwise, you can check us out at trustedsec.com or on our YouTube channel. And Phil and Mike, thank you guys both for joining us and putting this content together for all of us to learn quite a bit more about DLP and using it specifically with a remote workforce. Great. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Yep. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.